The gravity of the time is such that every new avenue of peace, no matter how dimly discernible, should be explored. Never before in history has so much hope for so many people been gathered together in a single organization. You will provide a great share of the wisdom, of the courage, and the faith which can bring to this world lasting peace for all nations and happiness and well-being for all men.
Welcome to another episode of Titans of Nuclear. Our guest today is George Borovas, the head of nuclear and partner at Hunton Andrews. George, welcome to the show.
Great to be here. Thank you very much for having me.
Of course. No, excited to hear about all of your experiences. But before we dig into what you're doing today, tell us a little bit about yourself. Where are you from?
Well, I was originally from Greece. So I grew up in Greece and came to the United States for university and studied engineering before I became a lawyer. And that was my first connection to the nuclear industry, because as coming out of the engineering school, my first job was with a company called Sargent & Lundy Engineers, and I worked on the design of nuclear power plants.
Fascinating. And you probably didn't anticipate that when you traveled to the States. I mean, what drove you to engineering to begin with?
I just loved chemistry, and I was a chemical engineer. I loved chemistry, physics, math, and so it seemed like something interesting to do. It was the hardest thing I've ever done, to be honest, the engineering school. And then, as I was finishing, I didn't know what kind of jobs I was going to get. And the reason I chose Sargent & Lundy was purely because it was in Chicago. Most of the chemical engineering jobs were either in some pharmaceutical industries or in oil and gas facilities. But this was in downtown Chicago, and that was the main driver, which ended up changing my life.
Yeah, fascinating. And what was the attraction to Chicago? Was there a girl involved? Did you just like the city? Like, what's the...
Well, a combination, actually. There was a girl involved, but also I love the city. It's a beautiful city, and I wanted to live there. So that was the main attraction, yes.
Amazing. Yeah, I'm a Midwesterner myself, so I have a special attraction to Chicago as well.
Yeah.
Okay, well, so what from there? So you took this role at Sargent & Lundy, and they said, hey, here's a nuclear power plant, have at it? Like, how did that evolve?
Well, we started doing different designs for the existing nuclear fleet at in most of the plants in Illinois at the time. So I worked on some of those. I was a beginning engineer. I'm not saying that I designed nuclear power plants, but I helped in the design of systems and cooling systems, some radioactive waste management facilities, things of that nature. But that was the first connection with the nuclear industry. And after I worked there for a few years, then I just went to Washington, D.C., where I went to law school.
And you had done all this engineering, math, science, chemistry, all of this. Why law? Why law school? That seems like a pivot.
Oh, it was a little bit. I always had in mind that I was going to do something from like engineering, then maybe do something like an MBA. I liked the engineering background as a background, but I didn't see myself as working as an engineer for the rest of my life. And then law school started becoming a little bit more interesting because of the challenges and it was a fascinating subject for me, how the legal system works. So I decided to go to law school as opposed to going for an MBA.
Interesting. And were you looking to broaden your industry exposure, or did you have like a particular, corporate law, transaction law?
Yeah, coming out of the law school, I had this general kind of interest in doing different things, mostly on the corporate side. I had some litigation experience, and it was a little bit aimless, to be honest. I didn't know exactly what I was going to do until I saw an advert in the newspaper, the legal newspaper, from Morgan Lewis, saying that Morgan Lewis and Buck is saying they're looking for associates for their nuclear energy practice. I had no idea there was such a thing as a legal nuclear energy practice in law. So that's I answered that ad immediately, and within a few weeks, I started my job at Morgan Lewis.
Fascinating. So, like, Yeah. So was there always sort of a pull back towards the nuclear? Or you just didn't know it exists? Like this just seems like such coincidence to me, right?
It did. There was a coincidence, I think, and I was always wondering what I was going to do with my engineering background in knowledge. I could see the connection to patents law, which made a lot more sense. Again, it had never crossed my mind, and it was a time when I was looking to see what I was going to do in the future. I was based in Washington, D.C. And again, this just came across seeing this ad, and that's how I got involved in the legal aspects of nuclear.
Yeah, fascinating. Well, take us through that journey. Different side of the coin.
So it was great. It was a big learning experience to get up to speed with all the legal aspects of nuclear. The practice at the time was very regulatory, working on licensing issues and the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. But the thing that attracted me the most was the transactional work as well as the international work. So I started working with two partners at the time very closely, and we started focusing on things outside of the United States, on the development of nuclear projects and transactions outside of the States. So that's the beginning of my kind of legal career and in the industry and what interested me the most. So we started working on those transactions with the team there. Eventually, I moved to another firm called Shaw Pittman that became Pillsbury, Winthrop Shaw Pittman, where I started focusing again on mostly on the transactional side and the international side. So I was based in Washington, D.C. I worked on a number of things, including the acquisition of nuclear power plants, which was a fascinating subject. It's a transaction buying and selling nuclear power plants. So understanding how you do that and what is the value of this asset, how do you value it, how do you deal with different things, the regulatory aspects, but also the acquisition of the asset or the shares of the company that had the asset. But one of the big moments for me was moving to London after that, because we had identified that in the legal market, there was not a lot of expertise outside of the United States, that people that really focused on the nuclear industry. So in 2008, I moved to London.
Okay, wow. So yeah, right during financial crisis, shale gas was still a glimmer in people's eye.
Yes.
Talk about that transition. You've now probably matriculated in your career some to have more of a leadership role, I would imagine.
Exactly. At that time, I had made partner now at the firm, and then moved to London mostly to focus again on the development of new nuclear projects outside of the United States. We started seeing a trend that there was going to be a lot of interest in development of nuclear. So the idea was for me to be in London and to be responsible. I was the head of our international nuclear projects team. And at that time, also, the program in the Emirates had started gaining more traction. So I started working on that. I had started working on that since 2007, and then I started working on the development of the program. So I spent the next 2 years there, basically living between London and Abu Dhabi.
Fascinating. And that was basically building it from scratch. Maybe share, right? Share some of that experience. How did you know where to begin?
Well, I was part of when we started out. There was a broader team which we had worked with people that you and your audience, of course, are familiar with, like Seth Gray from Lightbridge, and we had worked together as part of this team that helped set up the roadmap for developing a new nuclear program in the Emirates. So I was part of that team, and that there was a continuing effort. When we went over to Abu Dhabi, I was just fascinated by the vision that the people had there, the people that were responsible for the nuclear program, the understanding of how they want to get there. And it was just fascinating to just see a country that had zero nuclear expertise, but had a vision about what they want to accomplish and the right leadership and how they put that forward. So it was just a great experience, because obviously we had a lot to give and a lot of knowledge from our experience in nuclear, but also it was nice to see how a program can be properly formed and developed that we saw from the very early days in Abu Dhabi. I mean, I remember going there, it was like 3, 4 people that were involved in the entire nuclear program.
Well, yeah, that's such a critical. I mean, I will keep my bias out of it, but yeah, you can't make decisions with 25 people in a room, right? I mean, and so yeah, like that's such a, yeah, it's wild to think that is a more effective way to do it, is get the right 3 or 4 people in the room, and then you kind of know what you're working towards. But anyway, so you did this for 2 years. And then what happened? At some point you said, okay, this is sort of beyond, we've created the framework, go forth and prosper. And
well, we worked a lot of that on the development of the program, helped set up the structures, the contracts, did all the negotiations in order to sign the contract that was signed with the Korean consortium. And after that, we continued doing a lot of work for the ENIC program on its implementation and developing the organization and different other, kind of legal issues that we had to deal with. But then the question is now what? And that's when I had started doing a lot of work with Japan and with the Japanese financial institutions mainly on the potential export of Japanese technology around the world. So that kind of made me started working a lot with Japan. I started going to Japan from London pretty often. And but then, we had the events of Fukushima, which really changed a lot.
Yeah, I mean, tell us what that was like for you. It sounds like you had been involved in Japan previously, and then, yeah, how did that change your role and your sort of customer focus and value proposition?
Well, obviously it was a very difficult moment in general, of course, for the industry. A lot of the people that we were talking to, a lot of the countries that we were talking to that were developing new nuclear programs, they suspended, froze these developments. So that was a big focus of mine at the time. But it actually intrigued me, and also because I had developed such a close relationship with my friends in Japan, that I went back to Tokyo 3 weeks after the Fukushima events, and just to go to say hello to them, to tell them that we're standing by, that we're their friends, and that we're there in their time of need. And I think that was very well received by a lot of my friends in Tokyo. I remember walking down the streets of Tokyo and not seeing a foreigner there. Everybody had either left, and nobody was coming in. I flew from London to Tokyo, and I was the only person on the plane. So it was quite an extraordinary time. And then that was the time when I decided to move to Japan. And from there, right, a few months later, I moved to Japan. Yeah.
Amazing. Well, yeah, and it's such a good, it's maybe worth sort of highlighting that point as well, right? Is that in my mind, the tragedy is almost that there's been so much focus on the Fukushima plant and almost no focus on all of the lives lost from the tsunami, right? Like, yeah, I don't know. It seems to me sometimes that it becomes an excuse as opposed to a real, right? Like the industry loves using Fukushima as an excuse, but they, what did we do to actually tell people about what was really happening? Like, not much.
It's quite extraordinary, and I always have this conversation with friends and people that I meet in social places that have no specific knowledge about nuclear, and the misunderstanding that people have about the Fukushima events and what happened, how many people died, which we all know it was nobody, from the accident itself, as opposed to the tsunami, the real tragedy. It's astounding that is still the perception that people have, and it's unfortunate. And I think that's one thing that this taught me as well, is that we need to be in the industry. You need to be a little bit better at communicating, and speaking in plain terms where people understand what you're talking about. Because when they hear about this and they understand this, they have a completely different view about this, but they just are not well informed. And I'm not saying this in a demeaning way. It's just that there's an image about what happened and how it was reported. So most people say, oh, yes, there was that great tragedy in Japan, 20,000 people perished, nuclear accident. So in a lot of people's minds, these people perished because of the nuclear accident as opposed to the tsunami.
Yeah, causality versus correlation. Well, I always tell people, as soon as you mention millirems in a conversation, you've lost
You've
the
lost
audience,
it.
right? Like,
That's
let's
true.
stop pretending that there's this like deep technical conversation to be had. The other really funny factoid that I read, and you can go check this, that there were actually two employees of Tokyo Electric Power died from heat stroke because of the white onesies that they had to wear.
Mhm.
So like that, like again, like the reaction is worse than the underlying impact. Anyway, well, so okay, so you flew out there with the backdrop of all of this happening. Were you involved in any of the remediation activities, or were you focused on sort of still growth in the sector?
I was focused, I wasn't involved at all in the remediation. At some point, we did get involved in some related matters, but nothing directly affecting the accident, relating to the accident. But my focus also was on the exports market for the Japanese technology. And it was clear to me, of course, that because of the events of Fukushima, you wouldn't have new build in Japan for a few years until the accident, the lessons, the whole change and that happened would be absorbed by the country. But that there was still a lot of expertise and knowledge in Japan, and that the export market was going to be very important to them. And that's where I thought that I could be useful to them. And because to help Japanese manufacturers and financiers do business abroad is something that I knew about and I could support that. So that was my focus at the time.
Fascinating. So you did that for some number of years. How did that evolve?
Yeah, it did evolve. As you may know, there were many potential projects that Japan was interested in, including the Sinop project in Turkey. There was the Horizon project in the UK. All of these, in which I was involved in one capacity or the other. So that was a wonderful thing to see how we can help the Japanese nuclear industry export this great knowledge and expertise that they have into other projects. For many reasons, none of these actually materialized into actual projects, but there was still a lot of work. But the other thing that happened with my practice at the time is that although I was based in Japan, my practice had slowly become global. And so, of course, I was working a lot with the Japanese industry, but again, I was working in different countries, different programs around the world. So to me, Japan also meant a lot of travel. And I was getting on planes almost every other week to travel in different places around the world, which was fascinating.
Yeah, really exciting. Do you have any? Well, it'd be unfair for me to ask you for favorites, I think. Okay, so you built the practice. I mean, I think that brings us to today, right? Or any
Yeah.
other steps in there that you want to talk about?
Well, so I mean, I changed firms, and when I was in Tokyo, I went to a firm called Sherman Sterling, where I was the head of the nuclear practice there, and so we did a lot of the work at the time with the team there, which was great. What happened in 2020 when I moved over to Hunton is to help set up the Tokyo office for Hunton, but also to lead the nuclear practice for Hunton. And that was a huge change for me because I came to a firm which had a nuclear practice, it had a very deep relationship with the nuclear industry, as well as mostly in the United States, though. So my focus has been to expand that practice and to make it a truly global practice. So I moved firms during the pandemic, which was a huge challenge, and goes to show you how much we have how much we've developed our capabilities to interact with each other without having to physically see each other. So most of my colleagues I met 2 years after I joined the firm, because everybody else was on Zoom call.
Yeah.
Helped set up the office, and nobody had ever traveled to Japan to help me set up the office. It was quite an experience. Yes.
Amazing. Yeah, I guess yeah, we all sort of lived through that, but it's another thing entirely to create a whole a whole department around it.
Right.
Well, I guess it probably diminished your frequent flyer values as well, since you're.
Yeah, I did. I know they're not treating me as nice at the airports anymore. Yes.
Okay, well, so you've clearly seen quite a diverse set of approaches to the nuclear industry, and I might argue we still haven't found the right one,
Yeah.
right? And so maybe share some of those lessons learned and your perspectives on how we move forward.
Absolutely. And, I've been privileged enough to have worked in a number of programs around the world, uh, beginning, studying, developing. And I certainly have seen great things and I've seen mistakes. So in the end of the day, I think that what's most important for a country that's looking to develop a new nuclear program is a clarity of vision of what it is that they're trying to accomplish. And the second thing is leadership. It boils down to having a leader who's going to be taking forward the program, somebody who actually can interact with the highest levels of government, who has the capacity to call the prime minister or president to get something done, but also somebody that's going to get involved in the building of the program. And I've seen that time and time again, that once you have leadership, you see the things happen. And the other thing that you see with nuclear programs, which is always really fascinating, is that it empowers people that get involved. You see a transformation when they get involved at the beginning. They're a little bit concerned that nuclear is a new thing. We don't have a lot of experience. And then slowly, you see the confidence building. And then you see a true pride in what it is that they're doing, because they realize that this has the capacity of transforming their country.
Yeah. Oh, I mean, there's no question. I think one of my biggest frustrations with how the industry communicates and sort of carries itself is this like exclusivity arrangement, right? Like, oh, we can't find people, but also if you don't have 20 years of experience, you don't know what you're doing, right? Which is like a little bit silly. But I want to go back to your first point, because I hear this a lot, like this like state-led nuclear program.
Right.
And have we interrogated that is actually the only way to do this? Because like, that's not how Western countries work, right? Like if that is required for it to happen, like there's no way in hell we ever get there in the US, right? It's just not how it's structured.
Well, it's a great question, and it's a conversation I was having just yesterday with a colleague that has significant experience in nuclear new build around the world. The way that I see it is my personal opinion. Others might disagree, but I think that the involvement of governments in the country is very important for a successful program. And the reason I'm saying that is that there are some initial risks and costs that are difficult for a private industry to bear. Right? So when you're building a reactor, first of kind reactor for the first time, cost overruns, delays, all these things, a private company cannot accept that risk. They will never accept that risk, right? So that's where you need to have a government support to take that risk at the beginning as an investment. Once you reach to the second, third, nth plant, at that point, no problem. Things work out really, really nicely. But at the beginning, you need that kind of support from the government. And that's where I think that the West has run into trouble with nuclear developments, because we need to have more involvement in the government. It doesn't have to be state-led development, but there has to be a role for the states to support the beginning of a nuclear new build program.
Interesting, because I would observe, based on more broad experience, right, like natural gas, wind and solar, and some batteries, that when the state gets too involved too early, the incentives become misaligned quite quickly, right? So that, I always chuckle, you can't design once and build many. If you hire 400 design engineers, you're going to design 1,000 times and build 0, right? But what happens is you end up with a bit of a blank check, and all of a sudden, I mean, I don't know where you spend $500 million on design time, right? If you calculate the number of man hours that is, it gets pretty crazy. And so I'm not so sure that that premise that private markets can't take any of that risk is true. I also think that the reactor isn't the core problem in many ways, right? The reactor is relatively trivial. And so, yeah, I don't know. Yeah, again, I don't want to narrate too much, but I would sort of posit this for your reaction is that I think we should at least try a private market solution with government involvement, but government focusing on what government does, which is create markets and constructs, right, that achieve the outcomes that they want, and the industry doing what industry should do, which is delivering value to customers and shareholders.
No, I agree with that, and that's where it goes, but boils down to like a PPP, public-private partnership, and it has to be the kind of partnership. Now, exactly what role government is going to have, it's something that it has to be tailored for the country, the specific circumstances. And I agree with you. And I'm not saying that the government has to be involved in the design or anything like that, but I'm just saying that when it comes to first of a kind project, the project risk, and you're absolutely correct, I fully agree with you that it's not an issue of technology or the reactor design, it's an issue of the project. What that means is the supply chain, putting together the right team, make sure that these massive construction projects get delivered on time. That's where private industry has a hard time dealing with that, and that's where I think the support of the government should come in, and that could come in a program like an insurance program. It doesn't have to be more than that. It could be like a backstop in order to allow for private industry to take the risks that are needed. Now, at the same time, I think that the role of government, of course, can be like that, but I see this almost like a venture capitalist, where the government says, like, I'm going to put in some seed support money, whatever it's going to be, and then once you're successful, you're going to have to pay me back. And I think that's where we can see this is working for the benefit of the public as well, and not just say, oh, we need government support in order to make this successful. It's just that first unit, that first of a kind, the first time you're going to build something, there's tremendous risks, there's big risks, and private industry is very hard pressed to be able to absorb those risks.
Yeah, I mean, I think the nuclear private industry historically has not been able to structure and absorb that risk. But I mean, fusion companies have raised billions of dollars on like a hope and a prayer, right? I mean, a counter example to your seed funding, right? Like government as a venture capital investor is probably not a good position for them to be in, right? They're going to lose 9 times out of 10, and that's not a good, right? I mean, that's the nature of venture investing, and that's not a great, no politician wants to tell their constituents that, even if it's the right approach, right? You calculate a return hurdle on that. But what if they did like what wind and solar did? Why not pay $1 per kilowatt value once the plant reaches COD, right? Instead of trying to de-risk to get your cheapest cost of capital, what supply and demand work? Get a highest cost of capital in order to sort of crowd in that investment and only reward that success. Because I actually think you said this previously, like government is best at handling mega projects, perhaps in more like in autocratic countries, but here in the US, the government is not good at mega projects, right? And that's okay.
Well, yeah, and again, I'm not saying that for them to handle this. It's just that you need to have that partnership with them.
Yeah.
Without it, we're gonna have a hard time. Even if you look at the fleet in the United States and how it was traditionally built, it was built based on the monopolies of the utilities, right?
Sure.
And so you took you need to build a nuclear power plant. You started, and every year the cost went into the ratepayers. And that's a form of government support, right? Because they're forcing people to pay for that, and it's an investment in the future. That's what I mean. You have to, but you need to do something like that as opposed to just say something. Hey, listen, it's up to you. You build this. You take the $10 billion cost this is going to cost, and then at some point, you're going to sell the power. That's hard for private industry to accept. So that's what I mean about government support. There has to be, again, something tailored to the particular country and how it works, but it doesn't have to be just government support on one side, on one type of government support. It can be many things.
Yeah, and certainly if it like the large scale gig, you're right, a $10 billion or $20 billion project, it's pretty tough.
Yeah.
Well, so maybe that's a good segue. What are you saying here in the near future? Are you working on any of the new developments, any new programs? Like, what are you most excited about?
Yes, we are working on a number of new developments here in the United States, but also globally. And it's a very exciting time. So we're seeing a combination of traditional reactors, which have been built now and are starting to operate, the Gen 3 plus reactors that were, after many years of challenges, are now operating. So we're starting to see a good market for that globally. But we're also seeing a developing market in the SMR and advanced reactor space, and we're certainly very heavily involved in those too. And I think that's what's exciting about it. But this is also where, again, the danger lies, is that we have to focus on the project delivery as opposed to technology itself. And this is where we are lacking, I think, in the West, to have these project delivery companies that are going to be focused on that. They're going to be able to have that. It's a completely different skill set than having a technology company that has a good technology and somebody actually, creates power and energy in the end. And that's what I always tell people around the world. I said, when we are advising different countries, I always explain to them that, you're not buying technology, you're buying electricity, you're buying power. So, that's what you should be focused on, and who's going to deliver power to you, which means the whole thing, which means the equity investment, which means the lending. That's the package that you should be evaluating. And evaluating companies like, oh, this is the technology, let's work with these people because they have a good technology, you're missing the point.
Can I go back? This is the part where if it were in writing, I would go back and bold and underline and highlight in yellow your comments, right? Like, yeah, project delivery. Like, well, so how is that message being received? Because sometimes I feel like that just goes into the void.
Well, no, it doesn't. I think there's been a change in perception. I think people are becoming much more sophisticated, understanding these risks, and they're demanding more answers from the people that are marketing or selling nuclear technology and nuclear reactors. So I think that debate is currently getting much better because the customers are focused on this now. They're starting to understand it. And so I think that's where you see a lot of challenges, though, because again, which companies are going to be the ones that are going to accept that role to do that, be in that forefront of being the delivery company. And sometimes companies are forced into that role. Maybe it's not their role to do. And it's a completely different skill set. So I think this is where if I was looking at a government role, for instance, in a lot of these things, is to help these kinds of structures develop, and these kind of companies develop, and with some kind of support in order to allow for project delivery.
Yeah. Have you seen any use of best practices from other development industries, right? It's like a very similar skill set to gas power development or energy from waste or wind and solar, right? I mean, that's the skill set that we need to attract and incentivize. And have you started to see some of that, or we're still in this sort of how do we do this stage?
Yeah, listen, I think you're starting to see that, and this is the encouraging part. I see a new generation of people that are getting involved in the industry that come with that mindset, and they say, yeah, we know what needs to be done. I'm working with one particular company that I have in mind, that the founders of that company, it's a kind of like a little bit of a startup, but the founders of that company come from that project delivery background and financing, and they're laser focused on that. They appreciate the fact that the technology vitally important, but that's not the point of the venture. So it's really refreshing to see that, because I think that's the model that we should all be emulating. But as you know, nuclear is it's an interesting industry, and people that have very, very specific views. It's a slow-moving industry in many respects, but I'm starting to see a shift. It's becoming much more focused on these issues, on the project delivery and the financing and the development.
Yeah, and how have you seen? one of the surprises from me, sort of coming from the broader energy space into nuclear, was like a very defeatist, like, oh shucks, like it's just so easy to say that'll never work, and then like it sort of has this self-fulfilling prophecy, right? And so yeah, have you seen, is it still like a generational gap, or are you starting to see the industry more en masse start to be more optimistic?
It is starting to change. I think the industry has become much more optimistic. I think a few years ago, especially when you would come to the United States, and I was living in Tokyo, and I would travel into the United States, and I would always talk with my friends. I said, it's depressing to talk to my industry colleagues. They, as you said, they're defeatist, and oh, there's nothing's gonna happen. Yes, well, we can't do anything. People don't like nuclear. And it was this defeatist attitude. I think that things have shifted dramatically. As you saw, the past few days, in news out of COP28 in Dubai, the, pledge and the declaration of 22 countries to say that nuclear is part of climate change mitigation, part of our development. So I think there is now a new kind of optimism in the industry. But again, that's where the danger lies. It's like, okay, how do you take that optimism and interest and translate it into real projects and real project delivery? And that's where we have to be focused on. And I think now the private industry, the nuclear industry, has to be laser focused on how do we capitalize on this in order to actually produce what we say we can produce.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, yeah. What do you think? Go one level deeper. So there's laser focus on project delivery, but like how, without sharing sort of client secrets, like, yeah, how do we, in your mind, go about doing that?
Well, it depends on the circumstances, right? So again, looking at this public-private partnership. So, if you had a country that is interested in developing new nuclear, I could see that partnering with the right team and just say, okay, here's how we're going to do this together. And we will absorb that first unit cost and the risks in there and start developing a fleet based on what we're going to do together. So it's like this kind of long-term planning and thinking about how you're going to put together a program. And I think from country to country, that can change. Where I have some difficulty is when I see countries around the world that have different designs. They're saying, okay, in this site, we're going to do this plant. In this site, we're going to do another plant. But that seems to me like a very inefficient way of doing it. And if you're looking at creating the infrastructure, which the energy that you need for the country. So I think that those kind of discussions to be had between the private companies as well as the governments around the world on how they can work together in order to achieve a long-term goal, as opposed to thinking about this as a one project. If you think about nuclear in terms of one project, it's difficult, right? Especially with the large reactors, but also with the small modular reactors, because a lot of them, most of them are first of a kind now. And so you will have a tremendous cost. So if you think about success or failure based on that first project, then, most likely not going to be successful. But if you think about it as that part of a series that you're going to develop a fleet, that's going to change the way that you analyze this and you think about this.
Yeah. But does that focus on a fleet deployment and this concept of like a state picking a technology? Does that not just delay? I mean, does that make it actually possible to start on the first one? Because instead it feels like then we spend, right? We just said it's not about the technology, but then we spend 3, 4, 5 years to pick a technology. And then you're sort of, I don't know. That would sort of be my reaction.
Yeah, but it's not selecting the technology. It's selecting the team that's going to deliver the project, right? And that's it. It's not about the technology itself. Technology is going to be central to that team, right? So you can say that. But at the same time, you want to have a whole team that's going to be able to deliver that. So it's not selecting the technology, it's just selecting the delivery vehicle.
Yeah. And so, how would we go about, so you're saying kind of pick a team. I would posit that the governments, they're not good at venture capital for the same reason they're not good at project development, right? Mm-hmm. That like putting on my wind and solar developer hat, it's a 15% success rate, right? Maybe 20 if you're really good at it.
Right.
And so, how do we pick that team? How do we craft that team to maximize our chance of success, or teams plural?
Teams, I think, the best way to do it is to design it yourself, right? You design the team that you want. You understand what it is that you're trying to accomplish, and you say, look, okay, we need to get these skill sets together, and you help do that. It's not this notion that, I'm going to sit back, I'm going to issue an RFP, and people are going to come in and just issue, here's my proposal, and I'm going to look at it. Team A is the best one because they provide this and they give me the lowest cost. That's not the way to go selecting something. Like I always tell my clients, in different parts of the world, I say, selecting somebody is like getting married, and you don't get married just saying like, okay, send me your resume, your CV, and I'll decide who has the best, the best resume, and that's the person I'm going to marry. No, it's a partnership. You see something, you feel something, and that's how you have to view these kind of partnerships. And I think that that's the way to approach this. Is like, hey, do I want to be in this relationship with these companies and the exporting country too for the next 100 years? And that's a completely different way of analyzing it.
Yeah. Well, and I also feel like there's maybe a lack of understanding of like different contracting processes, right? Like we love throwing around MOUs as an industry, but then we also like try to jump into exclusivity really, really quickly for I still don't know why. And so to your point, right? Like you can sort of date multiple people at the same time in many respects, right? Which is where that analogy breaks down. But it's okay to have 3 or 4 people developing projects, right? I mean, spend money on building out the infrastructure to enable that competition, and then maybe 2 will succeed. Maybe they all will, right? That's a win.
I think so. Listen, I think it's depending on where you are in the process, right? It's like at the beginning, you need to have set up some form of a structure for somebody to succeed. But once you do that, and you have a regulatory system that works, you have the infrastructure, you have the supply chain developed, then I think that there's going to be a much more flexibility. And probably, with the smaller reactors, that's going to be where we go, where you're going to create the right environment, and then the smaller reactors are going to say, okay, now here's a site, here's here's industrial kind of facility that needs more power. Let's put a micro reactor there. I think that's where we can start seeing a much more entrepreneurial nuclear industry.
Yeah, no question. I long for those days. I think we'll get there.
Okay.
What else? What have we not hit that you're excited about in the industry or that you're working on?
Well, I think, it's one thing that I'm very excited about is, again, the new nations that are involved, that are interested in, and I haven't seen anything like this. And, I've been practicing law now for 25 years in the industry. And, obviously this is an industry that's got lots of ups and downs. And, I stuck with the nuclear industry because I believe in it, and I think it's fun. And the great thing about working on this is that no 2 days are the same. There's no precedent that you just say, okay, let's just use the contract that we did last time and just mark it up and use it next time. Every time you have to do original thinking, which is invigorating and fun and challenging.
So, and maybe a little bit part of the problem.
Okay, it's a little bit of part of the problem. I agree, it is but everything is first impression, and you have to kind of think quickly and just to come up with solutions, which again is great. But I think eventually there is going to be a standardization of certain things. But I think that's what's the most exciting part here, is that to see that developing around the world, and you start to see a lot of countries that are there in their thinking and their interest. I'm encouraged to see a lot of smart people in countries around the world that know a lot, that have learned a lot about the industry. And I think there's a tremendous opportunity for the exporting countries of the world to develop closer relationship with all these countries in that kind of partnership. So there's a lot that we're seeing now, and I think hopefully it's going to be a continuing trend.
Love it. Yeah, you're going to have to start getting back on planes if you aren't already.
Yeah, it already started. Yes.
Amazing. Well, that was incredible. Thanks so much for sharing all of your experience, and we'll be rooting for all of your projects here in the near future.
Thank you so much. Very nice to talk to you.
And initiate at least a new approach to the many difficult problems that must be solved in both private and public conversation if the world is to shake off the inertia imposed by fear and is to make positive progress toward peace.